So we should do configuration in a way that it requires less developers, but it could either be a technical consultant or, in the best case, the customer can just do it himself. So part of the reason that I came up with this 12-step list was I've been reading a book on Node.js programming, and it mentioned a site called 12-factor net, which I kind of stole the idea from. It has 12 steps for general programming, but one of them was really irrelevant, which kind of was the point that caused me to make my own list. So it says, apps sometimes store config as constants in the code. This is a violation of the 12-factor, which requires strict separation of config from code. And what that means is that configuration should be stored in the environment, not in the code itself. So the code, if you have it in, say, you have it in test, and you move it from test to production, you shouldn't have to change anything in that code. All the configuration variables should be loaded at runtime from that environment, from production environment. So that means that you should put those configuration variables by SuperOffice. But once you start making apps, then you have to take that into consideration as well. So there's the OWASP list, which is a list that contains something that helps you with what are security issues that we have to think about when doing web development. So I'll just briefly skim that as well. Next on the list, number 4, is about data rights. And that's an important one. Because SuperOffice has, like I say here, a well-defined system for managing which user have access to specific data. There's a role and a rights system in SuperOffice, and you need to make sure that you don't bypass that. You can't be a security risk, showing companies or projects or appointments which that user is not supposed to see. So you have to respect it, and you do that primarily just by using the SuperOffice standard APIs. If you do stuff using CRM script or the web services, whatever, this will be handled for you. If you try to get constructive and do stuff in SQL or some other funky way, then you might leak sensitive data, and you don't want to do that. So the customization that we're going to make is a validation for organizational numbers. So whenever we create a company in a specific country, that country has rules for what an organizational number should look like. In Norway, it's 9 digits. And in Sweden, there's other stuff. So let's go. So that's the field that we're going to validate. We're going to create a customization from scratch doing CRM script, and we'll use a trigger. And it's going to listen on whenever we try to save a company. Before we save the company, we're going to do the check. We're going to give the customization a name, validate org number, and then we're going to start writing some code. I think we'll end up somewhere down here. So we'll start by getting the data from SuperOffice. That the client has just clicked OK, and now we try to get that data. So we get the organizational number. Next is we get the country for that contact. And let's just say that if there is no organizational number, let's just back out. Let's not do anything. If it's empty, just return, do nothing. However, if we have an organizational number, let's do something. Let's add the rules, the country-specific rules. Now, I'm going to add some regular expressions. It's a weird, funky language. If you don't get it, that's okay. So I'm adding a rule for 578. That is always Norway, will always be Norway. It's an ISO code. I'm adding the rule. It says that it has to be a digit, it has to be 9 digits long, and nothing else in the beginning or the end. That's the rule for Norwegian. I'll add another rule for, like, Sweden, 752. In Sweden, they also have numbers. It should be 6 numbers. Then there might be a dash. And then there are 4 more numbers. That's Norway and Sweden. Now we do a check. Do we have a rule for the country of the company that we just tried to save? If we do have a rule for Norwegian or Sweden, we do a check. We check and compare what the client wrote. And if we do not get a match, we'll display a message to the user. And this is the point of my language demo. Here I'm hard coding a language. This is the problem that we're going to fix in a few minutes. Let's enable the trigger. No typos. Let's go back and test it. So this is a Norwegian company. Let's type in an organizational number, which is not correct. Let's just type in one which is correct. Okay, so it works. Break it again. It's not valid. Okay. Now, I have an English user interface. Let's change it to a Norwegian one. Norwegian. Let's break the rule, see what happens. Norwegian user interface, English message. Okay, let's change that, let's fix it. So we go back to the trigger, let's edit it, and let's add some translations to it. That's Norwegian language. That's the Norwegian language code. This is also a standard. That is what SuperOffice uses. So when we'll later ask SuperOffice what your language is, it'll be in that format. And also I'm putting in a placeholder right there, because some languages we might want to put it in the middle or at the end. So in Norwegian and Swedish, it says it's not a valid organizational number. And lastly, that's the English one. And remember I told you about what if the client uses a language which we don't have a translation for, then we should add that. We'll do that just in a second. This is the way to get the language from SuperOffice what language is the user interface in. We get the cookie called SOCRM current user UI culture, and it will return this language code. So we have three translations. Our script is almost done. Let's just add one more rule. Let's say that if we don't, that's the sign at the beginning, if we don't have a translation for this language, let's just dynamically add that. Yeah, my typing is... So let's add that language which they're using. I don't know, it might be Polish or Chinese or Russian, I don't know. Let's add it, but let's take the text from the English one. And finally, let's take the correct translation for the language that they're using. Let's change the placeholder into the actual organizational number. And let's output that message instead. So now, Norwegian user interface, if we change it, now we have the Norwegian language. This, I think, takes the sustainable part of it. And if I change my language to Czechoslovakian, I think it is, what will happen? It will default to English. Okay, so that's the demo. Congratulations, you made it through the 8 minutes. The next demo is a lot shorter, don't worry. So we're about halfway through on time. I think we're good. Probably will be a little short on, or we'll end a little early, I think. So the next one is environment. This kind of interrelates with the number 2, the configuration. It's sort of like the same point. For environment, we should be able to move our customization from one environment to another without having to involve a developer. And sometimes you've written a customization that it just doesn't work in online. And sometimes that can happen, but you need to be aware of it when you make that customization. That the customer asks for something and you can say, yes, it's possible, but you should know that this won't work if you decide to go online at some point. An example could be like a Sentry plugin. That doesn't work in online. Or if you heavily modify the web interface of the CRM, that's a no-go as well. But for the most part, whatever you do in service, that will just work. I'll have a short list of some of the things that you need to be aware of. But the essence is you should be able to move a customization from this environment to online, back to another hosted one, and back here without ever having to modify any code, and it should just work everywhere. Now, a few pointers on what works in OnSite, what doesn't work in online. So CRM script has, it's been locked down a little in online. There are some things like the file class that you can't use. The HTTP class has some limitations. You can't do SQL queries directly in CRM script. You can change a standard screen in an OnSite, both by editing it directly, or you can make a copy on the screen chooser. I usually refer to this as we have to choose between the plague and the cholera, because either if we change it directly, that will be overwritten when we upgrade. If we make a copy and redirect to it, then that will just get older and older as the standard evolves. And Sverre had some points yesterday where he's fixed some of the scenarios. That means that we don't have to change it anymore. But yeah, that's the difference between an on-site and online, is that in online you can only do one of those. Custom path, that's the web customizations. That doesn't work in online. SQL-based, extra tables and dictionary tables, that's, you can't do dictionary, but you can do extra tables. And then there's stuff that has to do with sentry preferences. You can do these in both places. But it's related also to the sentry plugins, which you can only do one place. And since we can't do this in online, people fall back to this. Sentry preferences. Does everyone know what sentry preferences are? Yeah, Marek knows, okay. Okay, so a sentry preference is that you can add a row to the database indicating that these are the rights for this company or this project or whatever. So you can override the roles and rights functionality by just adding some rows to the database. But it doesn't really scale well. So once you start going into the thousands of these rows, then performance grinds to a halt. Triggers, as we showed in the demo, those work in both online and on-site. That's good. And then there are some that, of course, won't work in online. You have to rewrite them to something else instead. So let's just go back to the list here. We did environment. Next is an important one as well, GDPR. Whatever customizations that you make have to respect GDPR. It means that you have to respect consent and subscription types. Whatever you create persons, you should tag them accordingly. Can you just export people just as you see fit? That should probably be rooted in what the GDPR setting says. Who can you actually export from the system? Who can you contact from the system? Who can you send information to? We have one of our apps in the online app store is an app for sending SMSs. And we had to add GDPR functionality to that one so that the user, he just chooses some people he wants to send an SMS to, but you can also add a filter saying that, okay, I've chosen these 100 people, but only send if they've agreed to this subscription type. So whatever customization you make, you need to keep that in mind. Does this involve person-related data? Is the privacy at risk here? Number 8 on our 12-step list. This is probably one of the last ones before the demo, I think. Yeah, this is error handling. How do you handle errors? And I'm sorry to say, Sverre, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Isn't it beautiful? Yes. This is extremely helpful. Thank you very much. We now know what the problem is, and we can fix it. No, I think that in being sustainable, part of that is helping. Whenever something like this happens, we should help either the customer or the consultant to figure out what is going on. In this case, well, we have to go to the log files, but perhaps we have to go to the actual developer and, can you fix the problem? It shouldn't say something as generic as this. It should say what the actual problem was, but without compromising any sensitive data. So, if the problem is some sort of username password issue, it shouldn't say, I tried this username and password and that didn't work. So, this, I also have a demo for this stuff. It's a little shorter. I think it's 2 or 3 minutes. So, this is a web service. You can see all of it. This is a web service where I've made an extra table in service called boat, where I can store all my boats. And I want to make a web service for exposing that list to some other system. They want it as JSON, and this is the web service to do it. So let's just briefly look through what it does before I start it. So at the top, there's an include, which is not standard. This is one of the libraries that Tony mentioned yesterday. That was open sourced. This is for making it easier working with web services. Then we define what a boat is in a struct. A boat has a name and it has an ID. We prepare a list of boats. That's the squares that you see there. That's an array. It means that this is a list of boats. Then we do a search engine. It's like it's equal select. We search engine into that table. We get each boat. We fill a boat with those values, and we push it to our list of boats. And at the end here, we want to convert that list to JSON using these 3 lines. And then we say return OK. That's the HTTP status code for 200 OK. I think you all know 404 page not found. This is 200 OK. And we return that back to the user or to the calling system. Okay, so let's start video. Now, to call this web service, we have to know the include name, and I made it public, so anyone can just call it if they know these 2 parameters. You can see it at the end of the URL there. So let's just browse to that URL, which triggers this script. And you can see that we got a list, a JSON structure of those boats. That's one boat, it has a name, and it has an ID. Fine, everything works. Now, if I just make a bug, whatever, I break something, there's no table called boat. And I go back and I call the web service, I get an error that is not very helpful. It says that stuff broke. Okay, so this is the point of, on point 8, error handling. How could we do this better? So let's go back to the script. Let's add a few more lines of code so that we have more control whenever a problem occurs. So let's add another struct. Let's call it an exception. So if you're familiar with like C# programming or something, you know exceptions. It's like this is an error, it's a problem. An error has a message, and let's also put a line so that we know where it broke. And just for making it easier to work with this exception, let's add a method to it, which converts itself to a JSON structure. So a struct can have both properties and methods on it. This is a method that returns a JSON string. Now, all our code from the web service here, let's wrap it up in what Sverre mentioned yesterday as well, a try-catch loop. So let's put all our code inside the try part. If everything works, it'll just stay in there. But if there's a problem, like the table that we changed, it'll jump down to the catch part, where we make a new exception. Let's take the error variable, which is always there in the catch, put it in the message. And there's one more, error location, those two variables are always there inside the catch. It will say where their problem happened. And then we'll return not a 200 OK, we'll return a internal error. And here's the JSON, which describes that error. Now, if we go back and reload, instead of this one, we get this one, more clearly stating what the actual problem was. We have the name of the table up there. We also have line, so saying which line, which character in which script is the problem. I think that makes this customization more sustainable than it was before. Do you agree? Okay, so we're nearing the end. I'll just briefly skip over through these 4 last ones. Scaling, I mentioned it that our customization should, when you write it, maybe the customer says that I get 10 applications a day sent into the system, and I need to list those 10 applications. You should keep in mind that, well, what is 10 today might be 1,000 tomorrow, for whatever reason. You need to make sure that you can scale according to the data. So if that means that you have to put some paging into it, like limit how much information you show, that's part of what I mean about scaling here. And in the link that you'll see at the end here, you can click in and read more about the details here. Browser compatibility, it's not a thing of the 90s. This happens too often. Guilty as charged. You as well, Lars. We have one of our apps from the App Store, like in the GDPR rewrote that I mentioned earlier, which we launched internally for weeks. We had been testing it for weeks as well. I told everyone in our company, you go on my shit list if you don't test our application. Because we can't test it ourselves, we see us blind on it. You have to test it so that we get user tested. 25 people say that it's okay, everything works. We publish it. Next day, a client says, it doesn't work anymore. And the problem was, it doesn't work in Internet Explorer. Entire company, no one noticed for weeks. It doesn't work in Internet Explorer. And you'll be surprised how often we see this. So it's on the list. We're never doing that mistake again. Whenever we make something, let's take a look at this list. Let's test it in IE, see if it breaks. Client, that refers to Win, Web, Pocket, whatever. Do you make a customization that works in one of them or not the other? Maybe, sometimes. You need to consider it. Do you have a very important validation or a business rule that you put into web? But if they use Pocket to change the customer, that suddenly the business rule doesn't get fired or triggered? You need to be aware that, think about it. Which clients are they going to use? And lastly, which I'm also quite guilty of, I know, is source code handling. It's a good idea to keep all those CRM scripts that you change. And I'm guilty of just changing it in the client environment and not storing it back in our source code system, where we have like a backup, a change log, who made these changes, when did it change, if suddenly a new error appears, what did we change so that we can go back to the other one. I think that's an important part of the whole sustainable act. Okay, so 12 factors. We've gone through the list. That's it. One bonus point, though, for sustainability. We are in a business with a lot of buzzwords, a lot of new modern technology popping up. And what is modern today is old tomorrow. So you also need to have a need to make conscious decisions of what kind of technology do you use. Can you change technology between each customization project? Once a year has passed and they want to make a change to it, and you go back and, oh, I wrote that in Angular 1, and the next one was in React, and the next one was in Vue, that's not a sustainable business model. So, yeah, I know. You introduced Vue, and we've stuck to it. Yeah. So that's like a bonus point. I think we're at the end. The top one there is the site where I put up those points. You can read more about the details there. This is a helpful tool for us internally, so I'll try to maintain it as we learn more stuff. As always, you should involve yourself at the community site. The forums there are a great way to learn new stuff. Don't just go there when you have a question. Go there to see what other people ask as well, because you're going to learn something. And Tony's mentioned the CRM scripts that we open sourced, which I used in the demo for the web service, libHttp. And there are a lot of other scripts that you can take a look at as well. So that's it. If you have any questions, that's now. Or are you just ready for lunch? Yes?
CRM script-wise, often I see customers having several of the same triggers.
Yes.
So, and it can be a problem if you want to give a message that is containing like info from several scripts. How do you handle that?
Yes. We had that as well. So, very interesting customer case. We inherited a customer from SuperOffice. I think it's 1,200 users, which was heavily modified in web. And one of the things that they did was they made some fields in the user interface mandatory, like the sale source and the sale credited and some stuff like that. And we decided to rewrite all those. So we practically took out all the customizations from web, and we rewrote them as trigger scripts. And we ended up with your scenario, that you have several triggers that all want to say something at the same time. So what we did was just combine those scripts into one script. These were sort of related, because there were several fields on sale that we wanted to make mandatory. And we just made a list of all the fields that we wanted to warn about. If you want, you could split it up into modules, which you include at the top, to make your code more structured. So the include that I showed, that's very helpful for taking some code and moving it somewhere so that you can reuse it from many places. Yeah, so that's the answer. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have one. Do you have evolved some kind of method for package and deployment? So are you using the package function in the service or something like that?
Yeah. Package and service works fine for the first time that you want to move something from your local machine to a customer. The next time you end up like in conflicts and yeah. We haven't really landed on a good way. We do different things in our company. I do the copy-paste method. Like I copy-paste from one environment to the other. Lars has a more professional way, perhaps. He has made a system for, which sort of looks like, I don't know if you saw what Tony showed yesterday with the Visual Studio Code plugin, or Tony and Hui made it, showed it yesterday, that you can just sit in your local editor and sync those scripts up and down. That's an interesting project. I hope that will be stable enough to actually use it in production.
We were playing around with command line tree. So it would be possible to use command line to import and export Serum scripts.
So you could call it from Atom then.
Yeah, there's also going to be a REST interface useful as well. I'll mention some more at the series presentation after lunch,
Mhm.
but not in detail.
Yeah, but that's an interesting problem. Regarding your package, that's the best solution we sort of like have. It's manual. Yep.
We're kind of thinking of introducing package upgrade, just like the ones we upgrade packages when you upgrade the whole software. Will that help? You just, you know, you have a package, it's version 12, you can upload and you give it the file, which is your old package file, right?
Yep.
And it would uninstall the old one and install the new one.
I think so. Yeah. As long as that is stable and I think so.
It would be exactly what we do with the status screen packages, right?
Mm.
So as long as the package doesn't contain extra tables, which are more difficult to recreate,
Yeah.
it should work.
Yeah.
No conflicts. Just file upload.
Yeah. Good. Question?
Yeah, regarding screens, you can't include scripts in most screen elements. So what is your best practice of handling logic between screens, at least the elements itself, the HTML elements?
Yeah. So you have one screen
Yeah.
that has two HTML elements.
Yeah, and then you want to maybe share some logic from another screen or something, and but you can include scripts. So how do you manage, like, do you just copy paste the functions between each screen, or do you save the logic somewhere?
I usually split up the logic, goes into a separate script, which only has methods defined in it. So if you run that script, nothing will happen. It will just define those. So typically these are like either classes or methods that we define somewhere, put the business logic somewhere, and then we can reuse it in screens and OK buttons and whatever we want.
But as far as I'm aware, you can't include scripts in HTML elements. It doesn't
You mean the element?
the elements themselves, not the creation script,
Y-
CDI.
yes, you mean if you add an HTML element, the third tab, which is the creation script, yes, and you can't add it there. No. That's, I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do these events work. Because you know, when you edit a screen, you have several tabs. One of them is called creation script, and loading something. Yeah. That creation script, and all the ones, am I right, Sara? Yes? That creation script, and all the ones from each HTML element are just put together. So if you need to include something in one of your HTML elements, you put it in the screen's creation script.
Okay.
And then you can reuse it everywhere. So you can also put call a global variable up in your screen's creation script, and then just check it for all the HTML elements. Perhaps you don't want to display this HTML element for some scenarios.
That's what I've been doing. I just have large chunks of JSON files sharing between the global environment, global variables, but it won't complain if I call a function declared in the creation script of the screen because it's just one script in the creation element of the screen.
Yes.
If I declare a function and I use it in an HTML element longer down the road, it won't complain.
No, because they're all put together.
Okay.
So yeah, that works. I think we're on the minute, actually. Yeah, let's go eat something.